Hey, Mr. P here. In this video, we're going to talk specifically about observations by witnesses. In the last video, we talked about more of the biological processing and the physiology behind observations and what's going on innately and instinctually within the brain and how the brain is processing information. So if you haven't seen that video, go back and check it out. This is moving into kind of the application of observations, and so we're moving out of how the brain processes information, and now we're moving into how observations are actually useful and how observations are ultimately made by witnesses and victims, and then how we can go about kind of extracting the information, weeding through the information, and figuring out what is useful and what is not, or what is correct and what is wrong, or so to speak. So, observations by witnesses. First thing you need to think about or know when you think about observations by witnesses is that it can be a crucial piece of information when you are working a crime scene or when you are working any kind of criminal investigation. Witnesses often provide substantial details or substantial information that can either make or break a case. But as we looked at, or as we noted in the first video, observations can lead to perception, which can lead to incorrect information, right? And so these observations can be affected by a variety of things, and I want to highlight all of these, and every single one of these is very important. And so the first we're going to talk about is the emotional state of the individual that is making the observations. So emotional state can influence our ability to see and hear what is happening around us. The more emotional a person is, the less likely they are at recreating the scene and recreating details correctly, because they are most likely in a fight or flight response and are therefore just focusing on survival. And physiologically speaking, they're focusing on survival, and so they're not focusing on making quality observations. They're just focusing on escaping the scene unharmed. So emotional state is really, really important and can influence our ability to see and hear what is around us. Now, if a witness is a bystander and really isn't in harm's way, then they are a witness that can make observations that are going to lead investigators in a more positive direction than maybe the victim can. So to follow up emotional state, anxiety also plays a big part in what we observe because of the same reasons, right? Emotional anxiety, fear of a stressful situation can interfere with our ability to make quality observations, but can also interfere with our ability to accurately pull things into short-term and long-term memory, which obviously if we're talking to witnesses a week after the fact, the witness has to be able to accurately recall information in a successful, positive way. And so if they were subjected to a lot of high emotional, high anxiety, high fear, stressful situations, they likely didn't make the observations in the first place and are therefore going to be inaccurate in recalling the information from memory. Whether the person is alone or in a group can greatly impact the validity of the information, because as you probably have noticed through your life situations, being in a group can likely lead to incorrect assumptions or incorrect perceptions, because the will of the group, so to speak, kind of supersedes all individual observations that are made. Okay, so if one person perceives something one way, they likely can influence the group based on peer pressure, based on other group members not being 100% confident in what they saw, and so they're likely persuaded by someone they feel is a friend, by somebody they feel is a colleague, by somebody they feel has a similar stance as them. And so the number of people can greatly impact the ability for one person in that group to recall information accurately. The number of people and or animals in the area is also important, because again, the number of people or animals can increase the distractions that can interfere with a person's ability to make quality observations. And the type and how physically active that person is going in to a particular scene, or how active the scene is around the individual can, like I said, lead to a greater distraction and therefore decrease the ability to make quality observations, and likely decrease the ability for that individual to recall information when it's needed. Okay, so important to note, witnesses or bystanders to crimes often provide better or more accurate eyewitness observations of crimes than actual victims do, because they are not subject to the same fear and anxiety experienced by the victim. We talked through a lot of these things that can affect our ability to make quality observations, and you might think that the victim is obviously going to provide the most quality observations because they probably were the one closest to the perpetrator or to the criminal in a particular situation or in a particular crime scene. And so the comfortable thing to do, it seems like, is to just go straight to the victim. They obviously lived through the situation. They lived through the crime scene. They literally had a crime on them. And again, you would expect them to be able to recall information and facts and descriptions way more easily and way more readily than just other bystanders, but that is not the case because they often, like I said, are in a fight or flight response and they're just trying to survive. They're not trying to recall a lot of this observational data to memory. And so witnesses or bystanders are absolutely crucial in solving a crime or solving a case. So eyewitness accounts. We are kind of moving away from the victim, and we're moving into just focusing on that eyewitness testimony or that eyewitness accounts. And so eyewitness is a person who has seen someone or something related to a crime and can communicate that to a crime scene investigator about his or her observations. So somebody that is an eyewitness is somebody that saw something related to the transmission of a crime. Eyewitness accounts of a crime scene events vary considerably from one person to another, and again, that is based on those same things that we talked about in the previous slide. How much stress that individual is under, how much distraction that individual is under, how many people are in the group that individual is in, specific stresses, specific fears, the amount of distraction, prejudices, and personal beliefs and motives also affect what that individual eyewitness sees. And because memory fades, our brains will often try to fill in details that we feel are appropriate but may not be accurate at all. So the longer it goes between the crime scene or the transmission of the crime and talking to the eyewitness, the more the memory fades, and therefore the bigger holes exist, or the bigger holes that open up, and therefore our brains, or the eyewitness brains, often try to fill in the details but may not accurately portray what actually happened. So, eyewitness accounts. The best eyewitnesses are going to be the people that are probably alone, less distracted by things around them, are not experiencing a lot of stress or high intensity activities, and ones that maybe are talked to in a really quick manner after the crime has been committed. So, testimony of an eyewitness can be very powerful in persuading the jury, but you have to know the shortcomings of the eyewitness testimony because you want to ensure that prejudices stay out of the testimony. You want to ensure that justice is carried out appropriately. You want to make sure that the eyewitness isn't filling in holes with unrelated topics or unrelated observations. You want to make sure that the eyewitness testimony is maybe cross-referenced by another eyewitness. And so if you have two people that are unrelated that saw the same event that all say the same thing, obviously that is a little more comfortable in the idea of the judicial system and using it in a court, but it can be very powerful evidence, but it also can be very persuading because a jury, I think, is just accustomed to accepting eyewitness testimony because, I mean, that's what it is. That person literally saw what happened, and if they are not 100% convinced or not 100% sure that what they are saying is accurate, they need to be very careful in what they say because it can be very powerful in persuading the jury. And there are people that are wrongly convicted based on eyewitness testimony, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Because there are people that have been and will continue to be convicted, wrongfully convicted, of a crime based on eyewitness testimony, the Innocence Project was born with the purpose of re-examining post-conviction cases. So we're talking about individuals that were convicted and have been sentenced to prison based on eyewitness testimony, based on flawed science, based on inaccurate observations. And this Innocence Project is actually using more concrete evidence in the form of DNA evidence to provide conclusive proof of guilt or innocence. The Innocence Project has actually been successful in looking at or re-examining these post-conviction cases using DNA evidence to actually prove guilt as well as prove innocence in a variety of cases since the 80s. After evaluating hundreds of wrongful convictions in the United States, the Innocence Project found that faulty eyewitness identification contributed to as much as 87% of those wrongful convictions. So, of the people that have been proven to have been wrongfully convicted, 87% of those people that were wrongfully convicted were convicted wrongfully based on faulty eyewitness testimony. That shows you the power and the persuasion of the testimony in a jury. Okay, the jurors are not trying to be malice. They're not trying to wrongfully convict people. That's not the intent of any jury. But eyewitness testimony, hearing testimony, details and observations from a person that saw the crime happen, obviously is very powerful and can be very persuasive, and has shown over time to actually contribute to wrongful convictions, and that's absolutely unacceptable. Eyewitness errors include mistakes in describing the age, facial distinctiveness of the suspect, and resulted from these descriptors. So obviously it's harder to give a quality eyewitness testimony if the perpetrator is disguised. Okay, if they're wearing a mask, if they're wearing glasses, if they're wearing a face protector, if they're wearing a hat, disguised appearances, a wig. It's often hard to account for quality details if the sighting is just too brief, right? If you just saw a very quick snapshot of the perpetrator, it's going to be really, really hard to kind of call on the details that are needed to convict somebody with conviction, right? So cross-gender and cross-racial bias, it's likely that people just naturally have cross-gender or cross-racial bias. And changes in the viewing environment from crime scene to police lineup. It is likely that when you look at somebody in a police lineup within the safety of a police station, you're going to experience a different level of anxiety and a different level of stress than you did in the crime scene or at the crime scene. And so it's hard to translate what you felt and what you feel you saw at the crime scene to what you feel and see during a police lineup. So all of these things can actually include or create errors and make mistakes or lead to the making of mistakes on describing the age or facial distinctiveness of a suspect, and therefore can lead to incorrect evidence that is then admissible in court and can therefore persuade jurors in the wrong direction. So, how to be a good observer. You know, while studying forensic science, that obviously making good quality observations is key, and when you go into a crime scene, the first thing that's going to happen is that you have to make good quality observations because you're likely going to be at the crime scene one time, and the longer the crime scene progresses, the more degradation can happen to evidence. And so getting quality observations, making quality observations, and collecting all possible evidence early is critical, often to the outcome of the case. So, how to be a good observer? Make a conscious effort to examine the environment systematically. When you go to a crime scene, you start at one corner and you work methodically to every part of the room. So you just kind of meander through the room. You're going to snake your way through the room, so to speak. Later on in the syllabus or later on in the class, we're going to talk about how to actually map out a crime scene. But for now, know that you absolutely do not want to just randomly walk through a crime scene. You want to actually work through in a very methodical, in a very systematical way, the crime scene in order to figure out and find every piece of evidence and examine every angle of the crime scene the first time. So on a microscope slide, when you're looking at evidence, you want to look systematically and make observations about every part of the evidence from one end to the other. You don't want to just randomly peruse through a crime scene or through evidence because you're often going to miss something. Make a conscious effort to turn off your natural innate filters. So we talked in the first video that you use innate filtering to decrease all of the observations and all of the stimuli that you're receiving 24/7. Okay, as long as you are awake, you are receiving information through your senses to your brain that you normally and naturally filter out to ensure you're focusing on just the things that are likely leading to health, leading to survival, leading to danger, that kind of thing. So you want to turn off those filters if you can, so that you can observe everything, so that you don't innately filter out some of the important components of the evidence or the important components of the crime scene. And so it doesn't matter how small the evidence is, it doesn't matter how small the crime scene is. It doesn't matter how big the crime scene is or how substantial, how large the piece of evidence is. You have to look systematically and innately and methodically at every piece of evidence, at every piece of the crime scene, at every part of the crime scene, no matter how familiar it looks, no matter how familiar it looks like objects belong to the crime scene. You have to turn off those filters and you have to turn off the emotions or previous experiences so that you can look unsubjectively at the piece of evidence or at the crime scene to ensure you're not missing anything. We're naturally inclined to interpret what we see. We naturally look for patterns. We naturally make connections and can actually help us jump to conclusions that are hopefully based on past experiences, based on things we've been taught, based on things we've learned. And so it's important that while that happens naturally, we need to also concentrate on making observations and to gather all the available information before jumping to conclusions. So you're going to naturally want to jump to conclusions because I think everybody just wants to like complete tasks and mark tasks off their to-do list, so to speak. But in the forensic world or in the forensic science areas, we need to ensure that we are gathering all the information before trying to interpret the information and therefore before jumping to conclusions, because we often will jump to the wrong conclusions if we don't have the full picture painted first. So make all the observations, acquire all of the evidence and all of the available information before interpreting it and before jumping to conclusions. You will have a better, more well-rounded, more informal or informed decision when you get to that part. So we know that our memories are faulty, and so while you're observing the crime scene, it's crucial that you write down, you draw, you photograph as much of the crime scene as possible, because you're not going to remember everything. Remember that the infographic or whatever in the first video, we said we're only going to retain to our short-term and long-term memory just a very small subject or a very small sample of what we actually receive through our observations. And so if you can write things down, if you can write down notes, if you can draw out the crime scene, if you can map the crime scene, if you can take photos, all of those are going to help reconstruct the crime scene later, which is really, really important, especially when we have to document what we saw, where we saw it, where it was, where we picked it up at, what the eyewitnesses said, and the judge is only going to allow evidence that is methodically and documented properly to be used during trial. And so if you do not properly secure pieces of evidence, if you don't properly document pieces of evidence, no matter if it's good evidence, you're not going to be allowed to use it in court, which would absolutely be detrimental to a lot of cases, especially when good quality evidence is hard to come by. So What do forensic scientists do? They find, examine, and evaluate evidence from a crime scene. Okay? They are skilled in making those observations. That's what the 2 videos have been talking about. You have to make quality observations. You have to apply scientific knowledges and scientific constructs to analyze crime scene and interpret those observations. You must be a good communicator because you ultimately have to communicate to lawyers. You have to be able to communicate to a judge. You have to be able to communicate to the jury. And you have to be able to convince the jury and the judge and the lawyers that your analysis as a forensic scientist is reliable and accurate, and that you have a quality, ethical reputation. I mean, people's lives are on the line. It's high stakes. It's science. You have to be reliable, you have to be accurate, and you have to be reputable. And so often, because it is such a big body of information, the forensic scientists often specialize in specific areas, and those areas can be in the areas of ballistics, like looking at bullets and how bullets travel through the air and how bullets travel through media, pathology, so toxicology, right? How drugs and alcohols and toxins apply to body systems so that you can understand what happened within somebody to create a cause of death. Textile and fibers are big portions of physical and trace evidence. Blood spatter. Okay, blood spatter has a very distinctive pattern. When we get to that, you'll obviously see that. But then you also have animal specialists, forensic vets, and forensic entomologists. Okay, there are specific areas that these people specialize in, that they get training in. So that concludes this video, and so we have talked about in the course of this video a lot about how to be a good observer, how forensic scientists make observations, what they do with those observations, and then ultimately what they do and how they specialize. So, see ya.